I'd like to begin this morning with a story from my first year in my role here as the college president. I was brand new and looking to learn all I could learn, and so I signed up for a seminar out at Harvard in their graduate school of education for new presidents. It was designed for people just like me, and I went there and joined that group of 25 or 30 new presidents from all across the country of colleges and universities. And we plunged in, and I learned a great deal, met some very interesting people that became friends, and I've been friends with them ever since. One of the fellows who was there in one of the sessions where we were explaining to the group something about the institutions we represented spoke very candidly, and he said that he had been called to this institution during a time of trouble. It had gone through a series of challenging events in recent years, and its existence was under threat. And he said that the governing board had said to him, if you are not able to help this institution find its way, to find a new sense of purpose and identity, then in fact we may have to close our doors. He spoke to us very candidly about that. Well, later that day we were sitting at lunch next to one another, and we began having a conversation about our mutual institutions. And he told me more about this institution, and come to find out, it was a church-based institution, denominationally connected, founded in the Midwest, along about the same time as Wheaton, antebellum, before the Civil War, a liberal arts college. And he proceeded to tell me more about that school. And then he began to ask me questions about Wheaton and about my own set of commitments. And I gave him a sense of Wheaton and its identity and mission and its history, and was able to actually talk to him about my own commitments to Christ as well. And he heard all of this eagerly, kept asking me questions, and you could tell there was something going on within him. And then he turned and began talking about his own background. He said to me that he was from a mixed religious background, part Jewish, part Catholic, and he was whipsawed between those events, those backgrounds during his growing up years, and that he found himself uninterested in spiritual things. And he wasn't saying that bragging. He actually, there was a sense of loss that he was expressing to me, that he wished he had a dimension to himself, especially now that he was the president of this new school. And then he said to me something that I've never forgotten. He said, actually, I'm glad for this conversation. Maybe you can help me. I said, well, how? And he said, maybe you could help me understand something about this institution. This college has a motto that I don't have any clue what it means. And what's more, I've gone all over the campus trying to find anyone who could tell me what this motto means. And I can't find anybody. Maybe you can help me. I said, well, okay, what is it? He said, for Christ and humanity. And immediately I found myself with a sort of almost a visceral response to that. And I said to him, almost certainly what that motto is designed to capture is Christ's summary of the law. When he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, the horizontal and the vertical and the horizontal dimensions, while for Christ and humanity is a Christian expression of that summary of the law. And that was what was intended in that motto. But all the while I was saying that to him, I was profoundly aware of the contrast between that institution and Wheaton. Here was this institution founded about the same time as Wheaton College with a very similar type of mission, obviously. And to this day, not only does it have a president who has no idea what the institution was founded for or what that motto was about, he cannot even find anybody on that campus who even remembers what that motto was about. And yet here's Wheaton College here 150 years later, still existing explicitly and intentionally for Christ and his kingdom. Two institutions founded at the same time with a similar purpose, and the one gone to the cause of Christ and the other still here strong and steady for Christ and his kingdom. What's the difference? What was the difference in the histories of those two institutions that led to those two results? And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that ever since. And I think the answer, obviously, behind it all is something to do with the providence of God and the protection of God and direction and provision. All of that's true. But at the human level, what are the reasons? What can you point to? Well, even there, I think the the subject would have to be a very complex one, and I don't begin to have all the answers to it. But almost certainly one of the key pieces will be the leadership, the presidential leadership that Wheaton College has given, the Lord has given to Wheaton College for, lo, these many years, as exemplified in the presidency of J. Oliver Buswell. We're in this series looking at my 6 predecessors in this sesquicentennial year. It's a great way to think about our heritage, our history, what this place is that we now have taken ownership of, and we're a part of this now. We hold the baton in our hands during this generation. Who are these people who have gone before us? And we looked at the founder, Jonathan Blanchard, and last time we looked at the son of the founder, Charles Blanchard, who finished his 44 years in 1925. And today we want to take a look at the 3rd president of the college. His name was J. Oliver Buswell. It was an amazing event when at the end of that almost 66-year tenure of the founder and his son, in 1925 in December, Charles Blanchard at age 77 passed away at his home. And suddenly, for the first time in its entire history, the college was without the leadership of its founders, Jonathan and Charles Blanchard. But amazingly, just at that moment, there came on the scene a brilliant young pastor. His name was James Oliver Buswell. And his coming led to one of the most fascinating periods in the history of Wheaton College. His presidency was a complete surprise. In fact, it was a surprise most of all, I think, to him. He had been born in 1895 in Wisconsin, went to the University of Minnesota, got a degree in economics there in 1917, was immediately the next year ordained into the Presbyterian Church in the USA, and went off to World War I as a chaplain in the Presbyterian Church. He fought in the Battle of Argonne, or was there with the troops who were, in fact, he was wounded and spent 3 months in recovering from those wounds in a hospital. Was later awarded the Silver Star and the Purple Heart for bravery in the course of action. Following the war, he came back here and took a seminary degree at McCormick Theological Seminary here in Chicago, and then later took an MA at the University of Chicago. By the time he came to the attention of Wheaton College in 1925, he was the pastor of the Grace Reformed Church in New Jersey. Well, I take it back. That was in Brooklyn, New York, actually, if I think about it. His connection to the college was an interesting one. At the end of January 1926, Pastor Buswell began a week-long series of messages, chapel messages, here at the college. He was simply here as a visiting speaker. But he was so well received by the students that, in fact, they put together a petition to ask the institution, the college, to ask him to stay for another week, which the college did, but unfortunately he had to decline because of his schedule. But by then, there was a rising tide, so to speak, on the campus, a sentiment on this campus from a number of different quarters that the college should ask J. Oliver Buswell to be their new president. Amazingly, to make a short story even shorter, on February the 16th, just a week or so later, the governing board of the college did exactly that. They elected J. Oliver Buswell as Wheaton's new president. And we have to stop for a minute right there and just catch this amazing sequence. After almost 66 years of the founder's leadership of this institution, Charles Blanchard dies late in December in 1925. 1 month later, a visiting speaker comes on campus who had never been here before and preaches for a week. And less than a week later, the board invites him to become the new president. Needless to say, these presidential transitions are done very differently today. It's not quite the way things get done these days. But it was an astonishing turn of events even for that day. And no one, I think, was more surprised by the whole thing than President Buswell. And surely he could not have begun to anticipate what awaited him, what he was getting into. And you consider the conditions under which he was called to serve. On the surface of things, it seemed to be the best of times. The college had prospered under the long tenure of Charles Blanchard and had come into the 20th century, and it was starting to look more like a 20th century institution. The enrollment was up to 377 students, which is a far cry from when Charles Blanchard had begun. What's more, all of this was taking place during the Roaring '20s. This is the mid-'20s, the so-called Roaring '20s, when the entire society seemed to be prospering. It was a time of economic prosperity. And yet, just below the surface, it was about to reveal itself as anything but the best of times for several different reasons. First, President Buswell, this brand new president, faced a very daunting leadership challenge at Wheaton College. He began his tenure at a very fragile time in the history of the college. He was following 66 years of the founders. The venerated predecessor, Charles Blanchard, had died, to everyone's surprise, really, just a month before at the age of 77 after 44 years in office. It's always tough to follow long, successful tenures, but especially when those tenures are the founders of the institution. And the community has never known anything but their leadership, that kind of revered senior leadership. And J. Oliver Buswell was still a young man. He was only 31 years old, with no contact previously to Wheaton College. And his was no easy task. His job in this new presidential role was to consolidate the work of those founders. After Charles Blanchard's death, the college's future was full of all sorts of uncertainty. There were so many similar institutions over even that period of time had gone by the board. They were no longer what they started out to be. And many thought the same thing would happen to Wheaton. It wouldn't last. What would happen to Wheaton College? Its future, with the hand of the founders now removed, seemed to be up for grabs. And a great deal depended upon this young, inexperienced president, and whether he could solidify what had gone before into something that could last out into the future. That was the big question mark hanging over this brand new young president. What's more, Buswell's presidency was faced with a monstrous threat right at the outside. Remember, he began in 1926. He's appointed in February of 1926. But soon after that, he's about ready to face one of the greatest challenges our society has ever faced, because it was in 1929 that the country faced the stock market crash that led to the so-called Great Depression. And all of that apparent prosperity immediately evaporated. And this was very early in President Buswell's tenure. You know, we think we are in challenging times economically these days, and we are. We're all feeling it. The college is feeling it. You are feeling it. Many of your families are feeling it, some of it severely so. But at the worst of it, it's still not what the nation was facing back then. First of all, there was much less understanding in that crash and the Great Depression of what had taken place and why. In our current economic situation, you find the experts constantly looking back to the lessons that were learned back there during the Depression and not making the same mistakes again in terms of trying to deal with this kind of an economic collapse. We're facing the pain these days of a 10% unemployment rate, which feels to us horrendous. What we have to recognize is the unemployment rate peaked at 30% back during that time. And there was hardly any safety net in the society. It shaped a whole generation. My folks are from that generation. They are now 90 years old, still doing fairly well, but they are marked to this day by their Depression experiences. That whole Depression generation faced a level of financial pressure that none of us have ever experienced. And so it was that, quite to his surprise, early on in his tenure, this young president, President Buswell, was forced to navigate a financially weak institution through the worst economic crisis the U.S. has ever seen. What a task. And on top of all of that, President Buswell's years also saw the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in Europe. Remember, this period, the period of his presidency, the memories of World War I were still very vivid, not least to President Buswell himself. He had been there. He had been in the trenches. He'd been wounded himself. He had seen it. The whole nation had seen it. And the students that were coming to the college undoubtedly were young enough that they didn't have direct memories probably by most of his tenure, but their parents sure did. And the nation sure did. These memories of World War I, just a decade or so later, were still painfully vivid. The entire decade of the 1930s, he started in 1926 and he finished in 1940. So the entire decade of the 30s saw the rising threat of Hitler and the Nazis beginning to threaten their neighbors there in Germany. Eventually, at the end of that decade in 1939, Hitler finally invaded Poland and Britain was forced to declare war. And World War broke out there at the end of the 1930s. The U.S. didn't join, of course, until after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. But the entire 30s had seen the threat, the looming shadow of another world war just a decade or two beyond the previous one, the war that was supposedly fought to end all wars. And here now the whole world is looking at a world war again. And it's under this looming shadow of world war again that all of President Buswell's tenure took place. To be sure, toward the end of the 30s, there was some rising prosperity in the U.S., but the reason for it was the war. We weren't in the war yet, but we were becoming the supplier of munitions to our allies all over Europe. And so there was a returning prosperity, but it was at the expense of anticipating another world war. And so it was that J. Oliver Buswell, when he accepted the presidency in April of 1926, he was facing some of the greatest and most daunting leadership challenges that any president of Wheaton College has faced. His task was to secure the future of the college on the foundation laid by the founders, but he had to do it while facing into the teeth of the Great Depression and with the threat of a world war hanging over him the whole time. And yet, despite those amazing challenges, to this still very wet behind the ears young president, no more than 31 years old when he starts, he rose to those challenges. It's an amazing story of his leadership from 1926 to 1940. He rose to those challenges. One of the first things President Buswell did was to initiate a major study of the strengths and weaknesses of the college. And in this, he was a true product of the 20th century rather than the 19th century. His predecessors, neither Jonathan nor Charles Blanchard, would have thought of doing any such thing. His was a very modern way to go about it. Don't just depend upon the anecdotes, research it. He was coming into the research model of the 20th century college. And they did that and looked long and hard at the strengths and weaknesses of the college, and they found wonderfully 56 points of strength and 55 points of weakness. And Buswell set out to address those weaknesses. And he spent his entire tenure doing so. For example, he built the college's enrollment. When he started, as I said, the student body was 377 students. By 1930, just 4 years later, it was up to 646. 5 years later, it was 805, and by the time he finished, at the end of that decade, the student body had almost tripled to 1,085. And this was during those very difficult times of the Depression and looming war. He also strengthened the college's finances, amazingly, into the teeth of the Great Depression and living through virtually the entire thing. In 1928, 2 years after his inauguration as a president, and after having done this research on the institution, he inaugurated probably the first, what we think of today as a major capital campaign. It was called a forward movement for the college. And the goal was $1 million to go into the college's endowment. And $1 million today is a lot of money, but it was a whole lot more money back then in 1928. He initiated this in 1928, and again, it was the following year that we saw this enormous collapse of the world economy and certainly the U.S. economy. The Great Depression had begun. And yet, just 2 months after the collapse of the stock market, President Buswell completed successfully that $1 million fundraising campaign. Throughout his entire tenure, he grew the college's programs and facilities and endowment. It was during this time, in fact, that the Black Hills Science Station was added to Wheaton College. I heard that. One of our scientists. He's most famous of all, President Buswell is most famous of all for strengthening the academic programs of the college. During his tenure, the college's faculty was expanded and strengthened. When he started, 24% of the college's faculty had PhDs. By the time he finished, that percentage had doubled, so that half of the faculty had PhDs. He strengthened the college's accreditation. The college had received the regional accreditation with the North Central Association back in 1913, but back then you needed a rating from the state university as well, and he achieved that. He achieved that with a Class A rating. He built a new library, and very importantly, he maintained the college's liberal arts focus. He resisted the vocational and the technical demands, pressuring us to become a technical institution, and maintained us as a liberal arts institution because he was committed to the value of that liberal arts education. And he did all this while anchoring the college theologically. He did solidify the work of the founders. At the beginning of his tenure, skeptics weren't sure whether Wheaton would make it, would keep its Christ-centered course and thrive. But by the end of his tenure, he had demonstrated that the college could. He consolidated the vision of the founders. The vision of Wheaton as a strong, Christ-centered liberal arts college. But then there arose one of the most bizarre episodes in the history of the college. In about 1936, a decade into his presidency, there arose some discontent in the college. This happens from time to time. I'm not even sure what all the issues were. It's complex, and I've not been able to sort through it, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but there were a series of complex issues. Some were worried about the rapid growth. Would the college make it through the Depression? There was a complicated controversy over a coach that the president first supported and then released, and then there was some discord with a couple of vice presidents who couldn't seem to get along with President Buswell. And then there was this external controversy in the Presbyterian Church. Buswell was involved, along with J. Gresham Machen, in the liberal conservative battle that was going on in the Presbyterian Church of that time. And he wound up, along with Machen, creating an independent board of foreign missions within the denomination. And a year or so later, the denomination took him to a denominational court and had complaints against him. They accused him of insubordination and siphoning funds away from the denomination and causing disruption in the denomination. They merely slapped his hands for that, but the controversies, those external controversies, kind of pulling Wheaton into these Presbyterian battles, caused a lot of embarrassment. And it caused critical voices to be raised to the board from students and from some alumni and from some faculty. This all came to a head in 1940 at a board meeting in January, and nobody planned on what took place, including those board members, but the board confronted the president with some of this dissent, and he in turn offered them three choices. They could dismiss him or give him a vote of confidence or continue the present situation. He was a strong figure and pretty stubborn. They asked him if he would resign, and he said no. So the board wound up dismissing him. Everyone, including the board members themselves, were stunned, and no one on campus had expected this, least of all poor Dr. Edmond. V. Raymond Edmond had been recruited to teach history 4 years earlier, and by now he was a popular teacher and chair of the history department. The very same day that the board dismissed the president, they fetched Dr. Edmond to the board meeting. He was at home playing ping pong, apparently, with his son, and they bring him to the board meeting and say, "Would you serve as acting president?" He was shocked and stunned. Again, the long story short is that he wound up taking it. He was a peacemaker, widely respected, a delightful man, and he reluctantly accepted, and he did an excellent job of pouring oil on these troubled waters. And thus did President Buswell's tenure end at Wheaton, even more abruptly than it had begun 14 years later. Thankfully, it all turned out fairly well. The truth of the matter is that neither he nor his family were permanently alienated from the college, He was not a petty man, thankfully, and he never seemed to be embittered by these events. He praised his successor and urged everyone to support him. A few months after his departure, there was an extensive tribute to him written in the alumni magazine by Elsie Dow, who had been an 81 grad, 1881, and here in 1940 she's writing this. 60 years later, she's writing this wonderful tribute to the president about what an effective president he had been. As you know, we now have a library named after President Buswell. His entire family was there for these opening exercises. It was not a broken relationship. In fact, his granddaughter, Kathleen Buswell Nielsen, until just recently, was a member of that very board that, in that other generation, had dismissed her grandfather. So it didn't wind up with a broken relationship, which is an encouragement to me. I'm always glad to see that. But I finish all of this by saying this. We owe a great debt to President Buswell, a great debt of gratitude. He served faithfully during some very difficult times. He was a courageous leader, a strong scholar. I have here one of the volumes of his Systematic Theology of the Christian Religion. Very erudite piece of work, and he published a number of things during his long career. He was a vigorous champion of academic excellence, and he was an unyielding defender of Christian orthodoxy. As a result of his time at the college, we have the Wheaton that you and I know today. He took that institution that was seemingly up for grabs as the founders had disappeared, and he consolidated and solidified it into the institution that we know, a strong, academically rigorous Christian liberal arts college. We can look back and give thanks. Why is it that Wheaton is still here for Christ and his kingdom when so many other institutions of that same period are long gone? Well, one of the answers to that is the strong leadership of these presidents, my predecessors, that kept this college focused where it needs to go and built it through the years for Christ and his kingdom. Let's close in prayer. Father, we're grateful for these individuals. We thank you for raising them up and empowering them and providing for them and guarding the college through this long and faithful history. We thank you for that because we are the beneficiaries of that history. We bless your name for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.